Get started, I think, do some introductions. Miikka, you want to start off?
Hey guys, I'm Miikka Luotio. I work at Tilting Point. I work as the Director of Developer Outreach. Previously worked in the industry for about 12 years. Started with feature phone, games for feature phones back in Finland. Ended up working at New York. So currently looking for new games, and we publish games globally. Our first game, Siege Titan Wars, we did a first deal in China for publishing there. So thought it was an interesting panel to join.
Awesome. Morning, I'm Vlad Ceraldi. I'm the co-founder of Hothead Games. We're a mobile publisher founded 11 years ago. We started in PC, console, downloadable, and in 2010 burnt all our bridges, pivoted 100% to mobile. Best known for our Big Win Sports series and our Killshot mobile FPS series. We have offices in Vancouver, Canada, and in Halifax, Nova Scotia, so we're literally coast to coast.
Hi, I'm Shintaro. I'm the founder of a company called Chorus Worldwide. We're a mobile publisher, a niche one. We take Western games out to Asian markets. We predominantly work with small indie teams. I think if you've heard of any of our games, it's probably a game called The Room, which we got from a UK developer and took it out to Asia. Yeah, I'm based in Vancouver, and we have an office in Tokyo as well.
Awesome. Great. Well, glad you guys could join. So let's start off. Shin would love to kind of hear about the Japanese market, sort of the trends there, and also talk about kind of like what opportunity you see for your sort of business model, which is a little bit different, that you're trying to execute on, and walk us through like that in terms of perspective of Western developers.
So I think for my business, for what we do at Chorus, we focus on, like I said, indies and smaller developers, games that I guess larger Japanese publishers, larger Asian publishers would tend to overlook. So I think we're not in the kind of the bloodbath of UA nightmare type stuff. So we're not in that side of things. So it's hard for me to kind of talk about that. I think what I would say to a lot of people is there are still huge amount of opportunities. Your game might not appear in the top grossing charts, but there is a lot of incremental revenue there to be made. And I think that a lot of people tend to overlook that. They just think it's too hard. We're not going to bother. No one's interested. But it's not true. I think if you do a decent level of localization, you do a decent level of kind of outreach, then Western games are getting more and more popular over there. So it's definitely an opportunity. And there's no real reason to be kind of intimidated by it, I guess, which I think a lot of people tend to be.
Interesting. Vlad, I'd love to hear your sort of thoughts from the perspective of Asia. Obviously, you guys have done some really interesting stuff in China. How do you guys thinking about the Asian market at this point? I know we've been on panels before together, and you have sort of an interesting perspective. We'd love to hear kind of where that is at this point in time.
So our perspective is that in the next 3 years, there will be a top 10 grossing mobile shooter sustained in the top 10. Obviously hasn't happened yet. When we started 5 years ago trying to crack into the Chinese market with one of our oldest war titles, it was difficult, but we signed a deal. Didn't ultimately come to market because of different changes to the company and things changing all the time, so we tried again. We had our exciting game at the time called, we called the Sniper game because we didn't have a name for it, but eventually became Killshot. We went to China Joy, we were trying to shop it, we're thinking we're trying to go east because we know that's where, it's a huge market, that's where growth is going to happen, and shooters aren't going to work, everyone said. And then, of course, WeFire comes out, changes everything. So we signed that. We got an opportunity to work with a smaller publisher in China. Learned some lessons there. It was very challenging to technology and other aspects of servers and everything else. So that set the stage for us to try to bring out Killshot Bravo. We signed that with Cheetah, which was a step up for us. And they did a really good job of working with us to get it to market, but lots of changes there, changing strategies, changing all sorts of things. And ultimately, we felt that there's so many lessons we learned, one of which was the economy models that we chosen for the games just weren't suitable for the market. Okay. Even though shooters were, all the major publishers had shooters in the pipeline, and obviously multiple success stories in China. So still difficult nut to crack to bring Western sort of focused quality and style of games into Asia, and vice versa. Although we'll see what happens with Honor of Kings, or which recently, what's it called now? It got renamed to
Arena of
Valor. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so that people don't know, that's the Tencent MOBA game that has like 50 million daily active users just in the Chinese market. They'll be coming to the West supposedly very soon. I'd like to ask one follow-up question because I think this is really important. So you talked about the complexity. For Killshot Bravo to bring it to Chinese market, from starting those discussions to the game actually launching, we're talking 1 plus 2 year and a half. It's
Well, our experience is different than what Shin was mentioning, but only because I think the scale we're going after for the titles we have, because we see our goal is to be in contention to be that title that is the top grossing in shooter space. We know we have a lot to learn, but we're not going to do that if we can't crack other markets in the world, be it Korea, be it Japan, and of course other markets in China specifically. So with Killshot, all the publishers had said no, shooters aren't going to work. Suddenly everyone wanted shooters, but now the game was almost a year old almost, and so now everyone wanted fresh new content, and it was rapidly changing so quickly because it went from everyone wanted, at that time, PvE experiences were popular, now had to become PvP was now key, and we view the Chinese market specifically as, because they had no console generation, that the phone is their console, and so they've got hardcore, they got midcore, they got such a broader spectrum than we do out in Western markets for the most part for servicing users. So, PvP, they're a bellwether for trends, for our market, for our genre. So, PvP was popular there before any success stories in the West, before we saw, before Clash Royale or any sort of PvP focused experience did well. There was tremendous success in China. So we saw that years in advance, we were able to start developing our PvP technology. All our games now are PvP focused, at least the core component. And so that was some of the learnings that we took away from all that investigation. Even though we haven't had the level of success we want in the market, we see them as ahead of the curve, so to speak. And so the mid-core success that they have, is merging with the rest of the world. And again, it's a matter of time. It's just when. And you see some of the titles they tried to bring over with partners didn't do so well. WeFire failed here, renamed. What was the final name? Rival Fire. It didn't work. Yeah. And so there's been lots of massive successes from Eastern markets not work here, and vice versa. Lots of very popular titles that did extremely well, and Western markets fail. Early success and early fanfare, but not sustained success.
Awesome. Very interesting. So, Miikka, you mentioned the recent game. I did a deal for China. You're obviously out looking for content. How do you guys consider the sort of global potential of games when you're sort of evaluating stuff? Are you focused on tier 1 sort of Western market as the primary, and if it would work in other markets, great, or you guys sort of incorporate that into your evaluation process?
So specifically with finding new markets, potential markets for games, what we've done before is, for example, with Siege, it's talking about European localized markets. We found some success with working early with some influencers that are have a big reach locally. For example, in Turkey, one guy was able to increase our installs by 900%. Simply by just doing one video, so that unlocked that place. So what we want to do is we try to kind of give the game to the hands of some influencers who are specific to some market and see if there's some pickup, some interest to the game, and see if that attracts attention to the actual game, and that potentially can kind of help validate that yes, there could be a market. So players in this market are interested in this game because an influencer is talking about in a video, and that kind of helps to also unlock the potential of what your game has.
And when you're evaluating content for publishing, how much do you weigh how this potentially could work in Asia or in other markets that are non tier 1 countries? Is that primary focus, or is it really just focusing on what the potential is in tier 1 markets for new games for partnership?
Yeah, for new games, what we usually do is we work with agents who are kind of based in different areas of the world, Whenever we get a game that somebody in the office thinks that has potential in a specific market, we try to give it to somebody who's looking at understands the local market. So friends and family as well of Tilting Point, we usually send the game and just ask like, hey, what do you think? Could it work in, for example, in China? And usually just get feedback from the industry people openly, which does help a lot. You get a lot of guidance, and I think with Siege, we had an agent in Asia who's sourcing a lot of games there on a daily basis, and he kind of understands the market better than any of us do in the office. So that helps to also kind of validate that when you show a game to a person like that, they understand the market better than we would on the other side of the planet, basically.
Awesome.
To follow up on your question real quick, with the original title we signed was called Rivals at War. Was with Dream Sky, and the complexity of changes that they wanted, they had a massive design doc and all the changes they wanted to do. So we felt that was going to be the right approach because they had a whole new take on the game for the market, and we were going to work together with them. And it was going to be a lengthy process, but then they were going public and all sorts of the changes. A lot of the titles they signed didn't come to market. The next time with Killshot, like I said, it was late to the market. And so, but we worked with them. Zhao was the name of the company. We worked with them. It took about 6 months to come to market because of the server complexity and other issues that we had to tackle. But with Killshot Bravo, we wanted to go ahead, and so we started pitching it while it was in development based on Killshot's success to a variety of different partners, ultimately deciding with Cheetah. So we had been working together for quite a while talking about the game as it was finishing. We signed it after, though, it was actually finished. So it's still not what we wanted. And again, it took too long to come to market. It took, again, almost 6 months to be able to work with them through the turnarounds. And in that instance, both Killshot and Killshot Bravo, there were minor economy adjustments that were made, but fundamentally, and better localization, but fundamentally, not a lot of changes to the game. So we struggled because our strategy, we thought, okay, well, maybe now we'll go direct to market because iOS has grown, much more popular. There's a lot more money we can make directly going that, and then licensing changes suddenly happen. Mm-hmm. And now maybe we can't go out on our own. Yeah. And so finding a good partner is still now our strategy. But then you're still torn between, do you work early where in a country where the companies can be so fast moving and because you have to submit your ideas and go through their evaluators and work with them, and it's such a lengthy process to localize it with them to bring it to market. Mm-hmm. Or do you wait until it's done? And so that's why I think sometimes you still see some success, but it's almost random. Like you have small little almost mild changes that suddenly have success. But they're surprising rather than sustained and systematic in a way that's predictable.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is key to mention is like the amount of effort required. So you talk about the revenue opportunity in Japan or China, but people underestimate the amount of resources that you are allocating towards these initiatives, and that can impact the profitability of these things, which I think is really key.
Yeah, I actually wanted to also add, just dawned on me that we recently had a game that was by a Finnish developer, and they share the data because the game is in soft launch. Just to give an example of how we identify the market potential. For that case, it was India. It wasn't soft launch in India, but the game, after we look at their data, they didn't see that themselves, but we looked at their data, 60% of their installs came from India. And we were just going through kind of like detectives trying to find out why is that. Turned out because the game was in Google beta, somebody just basically pirated the version of the game, and people started playing it in India, which is like, okay, maybe there's some interest there.
Yeah.
So then we were kind of pursuing further. So when you have a small sample size in terms of data, that can already give you some indicators of some potential markets for success. And ironically, those Android games that get pirated when you push them out for Google beta, that can also be an indicator of sorts if you pay close attention.
Awesome. Shin, would love to kind of get your sort of feedback. Like, how do you, when you're looking for sort of these sort of indie games for Japanese market, what's your sort of filter? Because obviously there's a huge diversity of indie content. Like, what's the specific stuff that you think works, in Japan, and also how we talked about modifications. Like, you have a lot of premium games and you sort of adjust the model. We'd love to hear kind of like what's your lens for looking for stuff, as well as like how you're making changes to make it work commercially.
I think in our case, the filter is, do we like the game?
Okay.
It's really, it comes down to that. And also, do we think that it'll stand out on its own right? And so, we don't, speaking to some guys from Japanese UA agency, and they're talking about CPIs of $20, $30. And we have a game, that, coming back to the room, the maximum that we can ever extract from the user is $3. Right, so it just makes absolutely no sense. So we have to look for games that are going to stand out on their own right. So we try not to. I guess the number one filter I apply is: would a Japanese or a Chinese developer make this game, this kind of game? And then we say, well, in that case, we won't take it. It has to be something that's pretty much unique of Western culture, but that we think there's a chance that it can be interesting to a Japanese audience. So. Another game we did was called The Adventures of Bertram Fiddle, which is like a point-and-click adventure game. It's about as English as they come. Very set in Victorian England, lots of British toilet humour. And then I really liked that game. And again, the reason we took that was because it's got a very unique art style that no one in Japan would ever make that kind of game. Point-and-click is well known enough that it makes sense. And ultimately, we thought it would be a challenge, I guess, and fun, and so we rely on the things to kind of stand out on their own. Because if we find a game that looks too similar to something that could come out, it'll just get buried. So we have to rely on that kind of thing.
Interesting. And how are you? And in terms of modification, so
it depends. It depends on the game. So the Room, Bertram Fiddle, those kinds of things, they have such a unique, distinctive look that it would be pointless to say animify any of it. You would lose the character of the game, and again, it would just blend into the crowd. Where we have done modifications, there was a game called Kitty Powers Matchmaker, which was a dating game, and in that instance, we showed it to a few people at Tokyo Game Show a couple of years ago. People loved the game and the approach. It dealt with relationships same-sex relationships treated exactly the same as heterosexual relationships, which dating games in Asia typically haven't tended to do. So again, I was really interested in that. But the feedback we got was people hated the characters. They hated the faces. So we had to go in and modify that just so that it wasn't going to put people off. So we did a level of culturalization there, really just to make it so that people's initial reaction was, "Oh my God, what is that? What's going on there?" And so we didn't get any kudos for the artwork that we did in the end. We just didn't get any negativity from it, which was really the goal. Just make it so that people can see the game, accept it, see that it's different from other kind of dating games, and play it for that reason.
Interesting.
Something different we've done we have a hero shooter, a team-based hero shooter that we're developing for mobile. First off, we picked an economy model that had already worked in Korea, China, and Japan. So even if we were focusing on the West to start, we could modify it, and the internal workings would allow for that versus the older games, which would be almost a redo.
Right.
And so we started there with the economy model. We then took our characters, and with initial take with them all, we thought they were cool. And we did tests in all three markets to sort of see how they responded to the characters. Got quite differences. Each region had their own tastes for sure.
Yeah.
So then we took that feedback and tried to amalgamate it into, because we didn't want to have separate characters per region. We could go there, but we didn't want to do that. So we blended the ideas together to make specific characters in the mix for different countries, and then the ones that we could amalgamate all the feedback into one to kind of make it more appealing, and we retest it to sort of see whether or not we had changed the appeal. We believe we have. So we definitely are looking towards changing our content, building from the very beginning of our ideas, economies, and game systems that are familiar, so the game will not feel foreign as much as they have traditionally.
Interesting. And how do you guys view, love to like how are you viewing like we talked about China a bit, like how are you viewing like Japan and Korea as these are like basically secondary markets to the West, like very, very important markets that you're definitely going to focus on and do some self-publishing activities? Like, how do you view those markets?
Huge opportunities, we believe. Again, towards our goal of making that top grossing shooter, we can't ignore them. And if we can, we've been told by many partners that if we can get it right in Korea, we have a great chance of making it work in China. But at the same time, most shooters have to be 17 plus, and 17 plus doesn't really work based on the ratings in China. You have to really work hard to get around that rating. You can. There are shooters that are out there, but from the West, to kind of navigate those waters is a little more challenging. So that's been a bit slower for us, but that's been an untapped market that we've been trying to figure out. And in Japan, all our shooters have had niche success in the sense that when we looked at our data as well, we saw how valuable the users were. There's some surprising profits that we had made without focusing on it. So then we did some marketing tests, and I have half the marketing team in the back there, but they can speak better to me than I could. But it was very challenging because many of the techniques and maturity of UAF systems and methods that are in the rest of the world seem to be a bit not quite as developed. And so that was much more challenging for us to run effective UA campaigns compared to other markets. But we still see it as a huge opportunity, for sure.
Cool. Miikka, curious, because obviously you're looking for content to publish. We talked about stuff from the West and then bringing it to like China or something. Do you see content from developers in Asia that you are interested in bringing to the Western market? Like, have you seen stuff that can work? What do you think the potential is around that? Do they have the understanding of our market to like actually like build content that will resonate here?
Yeah, I think the majority of games that we get pitched from Asia to be published in the Western market, it's pretty tricky because I would say majority of the games as they are not necessarily suitable. There's some things to do with complexity, the team, the visual look of that. But I think in the end of the day, if we find a game is good in terms of evaluating it, like it's a solid game in its own right. Usually, if you start doing a CPI tests in Western markets by just doing a really quick pass on, for example, store assets, and you do a Facebook campaign just to get a CPI test. In Western markets, that's like a couple day job to validate basically if that could actually if it has interest in the West. So it's a process we do after we kind of realize that the game is solid. We usually simply just do some different marketing assets that are more kind of Western suited, localized them. So
what do you see? What are the main areas that prevent something from working? Is it the gameplay, like the art style? Like, what are the kind of things that you see that are problematic for bringing it over?
I think the big thing that I'm seeing usually tends to be a problem is the session lengths, especially for mid-core games. The session lengths tend to be longer, and it tends to be more okay to be longer on Asian games. I'm just generalizing a little bit here, but that seems to be quite often one of the topics. So the games require your engagement for longer and more intense engagement from mobile games, which sometimes translates into having some issues with, for example, early retention when you soft launch in the Western market. Some of those can be adjusted, but in sometimes the game's fundamental design of the game just doesn't allow for that. So that may be tricky in those cases. And in some cases, the visual style may be not just suitable, or it's going to be a totally different game if you start making it more appealing in terms of Western markets. So oftentimes the question is also the visual style. Although I've seen in the last couple of years that improve a lot, where if you bring games from, for example, Asia. That look really Asian and work there really well, and you bring it to West. A lot of gamers are more excited about that. But I think it has to do with the kind of rise of esports and all that. That kind of unites people across continents over games more. And the culture is being shared by players in terms of them liking and accepting these type of games more.
Interesting. So obviously we talk about, focus on Japanese market. Have you guys applied your model to other markets in Asia? If not, curious what the opportunity might be for these sort of more indie, creative experiences in maybe Korea or China or other, international markets.
I mean, even though we're, I guess, a Japanese company, and we focus on Japan, our biggest market is still China. And so we basically do the same game, obviously localized into the relevant languages, but China, dwarfs our other markets that we launch into. So, we don't particularly do anything different for each of those territories, Japan, apart from the translations. But yeah, I think China is still, for us, it's still the biggest, even though bizarrely we focus on it the least.
Okay.
It's just the sheer scale of it. And we've been lucky where, again, I think this comes back down to the stuff that the games that we choose to publish, because we don't have large UA budgets and we don't tend to go into that, we're not in that ring. The games that we choose have always tended to get featured. Mm-hmm. And that's been kind of a number one driver. We do PR in a lot of games PR in Japan and in Taiwan. We do next to none, I would say, in China. But again, China is still our biggest market, just purely because we've been lucky getting picked up by features and just the sheer scale of it. So
cool. So yeah, I'd love to talk a little about market trends, some of the international markets from your guys' perspective. I think one of the topics is obviously consolidation. So you have a lot of this cross-border consolidation. You have companies entering our market from Asia through different strategies. If it's M&A, you have companies that have entered our market from Asia that have exited our market. If it's some of the Japanese ones, yeah, we'd kind of love to get some thoughts around where the trends for this are going, where potentially your companies fit into this, and how you see things evolving. Because obviously it creates some the mature market has created a lot of pressure for smaller studios, and the bigger ones are looking to get bigger. So yeah, I would love to. I mean, Shin, I don't know if any comments around the sort of greed DNA sort of being early to the West and now are essentially gone.
I think lest we forget, looking outside mobile, Nintendo and Sony are Japanese companies, and they've done pretty well with their games overseas. So yeah. I think there's nothing inherently that Japanese companies can't succeed in the West. Mobile is obviously different. I had a look at the top grossing in Japan this week, and I think it's Fate, Grand Order, and Grand Blue Fantasy. Those games are such hardcore JRPGs on mobile that I think they're going to have a hard time transitioning beyond a niche audience. It'll still be a big Western niche audience who like those kind of things, but I think it's going to be tougher as those companies focus more and more on the home market. And then when they go overseas, they'll think about China, they'll think about Korea, but they'll stay within Asia. I think they're going to have a harder time getting over to the West, as it were. Mm-hmm. But, when you talk about green DNA, I think, that mobile is a strange place where Monster Strike and Puzzle and Dragons, these massive behemoths from a couple of years ago, really didn't find success in the West. So I think people are they're going to keep trying, but I think that as they see more and more success, as they start tailoring their games more for the home market and the Asian markets, it's going to be even harder for them to find success in the West. Mm-hmm. I think. But again, it is different in console. But I just wonder whether some of that learning, especially when you look at what the DNA collaboration with Nintendo is doing, obviously those things are starting to. They've got global IPs that will work. So I think a lot of those mobile first companies are going to start to just retrench back into Japan, and very successful there. The ones that are a little bit, the older companies like Bandai Namco, who have had a bit more of a Western outlook for decades, they will probably start to find more success, in my opinion.
Yeah. Vlad, how do you see, this? Obviously, there's a lot of, M&A interest from China, and you guys have been pretty aggressive there. What's your sort of sense of the market in terms of different opportunities for Western companies, and also the sort of strategy and thinking of these companies coming into our market?
I definitely think, as I said, one of our studios is based in Vancouver, Canada. And, we had Gumi there and they disappeared. We had Gree there, they disappeared. We had DNA there, they disappeared. So they've all tried. And some of it was a victim of their early success, where they came from more HTML, non-native, and they took all those systems and tried to make them work in the Western markets, and then they don't get the same profits over here, and so they retreat. But then you get, there's a new wave, I think, coming of investment and into our area anyway. We believe we're seeing it. A lot of interest from Korea specifically and China. To again try to take some of their properties that are doing so well and find no one's cracked this nut, with regards to what are the key differences. And that's why I mentioned that Arena of Valor is going to be very interesting. Something when Josh was speaking, something that came to mind that we've looked at is, for whatever, I'm simplifying, but culturally, the complexity that the gamers seem to accept in the UI and in the systems in some of the Asian territories don't seem to mesh well with the rest of the world. You look at the UI for Honor of Kings. It's just daunting for most Western players. And so there's challenges like that, but it's not just a UI UX problem. There's the systems themselves and understanding them. So there's this divide that still exists that both companies from both regions are trying to figure out, as quickly as we can. It will be figured out. There will be changes made, and even with Arena of Valor, you're seeing them try different weird character types that don't seem to match, or different, the name change, all sorts of different things are trying to make it successful. So, anyway, so we're excited because of the potential there, and again, we have invested there. We think we've learned a lot. We hope we have anyway. But to your question, I do think there'll be continued interest from those markets to Western-focused companies to work with, either on their own properties or on new IPs that they hope they can help from its inception develop into something that could be more worldwide appeal.
Yeah, Miikka, I'd love to hear it because you're talking to everyone, developers everywhere in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing happening in Finland these days. I've noticed some studios who have in their business plan when they start a new game development company, in their business plan is to get an M&A from an Asian company. It's like you set up a company, and but that's an echo of a trend line that is caused by a regional success in terms of development. For example, in Finland, that has happened there, and there's been some deals with some Asian companies, and that has kind of unlocked the interest. So it's a cascading effect, I think. So looking at different regional development hubs seem to follow a trend line where there's specific markets that have shown, one or two successes. Then that actual development environment, that hub, will start modifying, kind of like understanding that there's an opportunity for me to make a game, get investment from a say a Chinese company, or get acquired by them as a whole. And it's interesting how that dynamic is developing, at least in Northern Europe right now. I would say that that's something that I've seen in the last couple of years happen very strongly. In terms of where it's going to go, I would say there's a certain, for example, in Finland, a certain bubble to it in a way where I can see when so many companies put in their business plan that they want to get acquired by a Chinese chicken farm or something. It kind of gets crazy at a certain point. So I think that's going to slow down a little because some of the investment money will not be recouped. So it kind of balances itself out. So my feeling is that while there's a trend line, for example, in Northern Europe for that, specifically Finland, that'll balance itself out in the next couple of years. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, so there are, I mean, it definitely seems like there are developers that sort of incorporate their sort of Asia into their strategy early to set themselves up for success. I mean, Shin, you worked with SpaceApe a while ago. I mean, they were a pretty small team early on, but they seemed very intelligent of like focusing on those markets in a thoughtful way around like engaging players and building partnerships. Can you share any thoughts about like what their sort of strategy was and what worked well for them?
I mean, specifically on SpaceApe.
I mean, anything similar. I mean, that was just one example.
I mean, for them, they I think they've stated pretty publicly that they modeled themselves, or they looked very closely at Supercell, and obviously now they're very closely tied.
Worked out well.
Yeah, that worked out very well for them. And so when they had the Transformers license, it was just one of those strange things where the license in Japan wasn't owned by Hasbro; it was owned by a separate company. So they needed someone to help them acquire that license, and then I've turned into a 1.5 long engagement doing a bunch of other things. But I think for them, it was never a question of, okay, the license in Japan is hard, so we're not going to do it. They were always going to do that. And we just helped them do that a little bit. So I think, yes, they were very, very focused on Japan. They were very focused on, despite how much harder it was than the rest of the world, getting it done. So, yeah, I think that's, for them, it's worked out. And they have Japanese staff in London managing the Japanese community.
So yeah, that's what I think is really interesting. So they, even when they were a team of like 30 or 40, I think they had basically staff for like China, Korea, Japan, focused on those markets in terms of engaging audience, customer support, stuff like this, which is, I think, pretty unique. But I think was able to get them some additional traction in those markets.
No, absolutely. And I think they were a particularly forward-looking company, and I think they still are. So, yeah, and that's reaped the rewards for them in all manner of ways.
Vlad, how do you guys look at, obviously you have global audiences, like, do you work in the same way where you have like localized sort of teams that are really focused on specific key markets that are fairly different? Or how do you guys view keeping players engaged and customer support, things like that? Is it
for those markets, we determined that we had to find partnerships. Because like even if you're talking about China, you talk about how they treat their VIP customers and how they have to handle transactions and just support. And then, especially if you're talking Android and iOS, and Android payment methods and changing and all sorts of different regulations. So that was a must from our perspective, even though we dabbled looking at could we just go iOS for a brief period of time. And the same goes for Korea and Japan, just feeling that they are big enough opportunities that they could sustain. But they would probably have to go through partnerships. Since we've investigated that, but we've not executed anything in either region on that level. So in the meantime, we've done more setting ourselves up for that, and with the content and with our investigations and different tests we've done, but not actually going the partnership route. But we think that's definitely still our strategy. Now, as far as you mentioned earlier about the investments. I mean, obviously, Kabam Asset, their studio sold to a Chinese company. There's lots of companies in Vancouver that have had investment from Asian companies, be it, a variety of different companies. So it's not quite Finland necessarily, but we still see that activity. So it's going to be, again, for the next, I think, year anyway, I think that'll continue.
So we focus a lot, obviously, on Asia. It's 3 of the top 5 markets, I believe. What other markets are interesting to folks, even if it's not relevant necessarily to your business? What markets are intriguing? Obviously, we talked briefly about India, Southeast Asia, Middle East, like Russia, Eastern Europe, obviously for like more, core games. I mean, any other markets for you guys that either for your business or just in general you think on the mobile side are interesting and have like decent potential that maybe aren't, a lot of people are focusing on?
Right now, in terms of, I could say at least in terms of talking with developers and engaging with them in terms of like trying to form partnerships over the games. There seems to be a recurring topic in the last year where specific developers, especially when their game is themed around sci-fi or space, seem to be interested in Russian markets as well. Not necessarily tied only to that team, but in general, that's been a topic when I meet developers more and more these days. I would say the last half a year, it has come up a lot. So that's definitely a place to at least for us to explore. If we find the right game that could work really well there, and it's all about the team and the appeal. And we're trying to kind of figure out what would be the perfect game for example, Russian market or Indian market. But yeah, it's usually developers, when I talk to them, they already have that feeling, and you just have to validate that for them. No matter you get a deal or not with them, but you just, that's what I try to do.
Okay. Vlad, Shin?
Sorry, all I was going to say was I think from the other side of things, looking at developers and where we see good pockets. When we started the company, I kind of hoped that there'll be a lot of good Japanese indie developers that we could help bring the other way around, but that just hasn't materialized yet. There are a few, but they're still, a lot of them still seem to be at a kind of bedroom coding kind of level and that kind of stuff. Whereas obviously the UK, you have a lot of good small to medium-sized indie studios. The one that surprised me is Taiwan. There seem to be a lot of good mobile developers coming out. So we're looking at those guys and seeing if we can help them either get out to the rest of Asia or get out to the West. Obviously, I think it might be a similar thing to Finland. Finnish developers know that their home market isn't big enough to be sustainable. So does Taiwanese. So they're naturally more globally looking. And there seems to be a very good talent pool there and an ambition and a drive. So from a supply side, I guess, of games and developers, there's a couple of pockets that surprised me, Taiwan being one of them.
So we do quite well with shooters in Russia.
Yeah.
And from a download perspective, Brazil. So, for example, localizing in Brazilian Portuguese was a no-brainer. So trying to extract more value from users that are in Russia or Brazil and making sure the experience can be performed well in those territories, I think, is something that we've been looking at for the last little while. I'd say India, not so much. I mean, our view is it's probably China 10 years ago, and so it's still a huge opportunity, but it's so far out for us, and we've got these other much more bigger opportunities that are right in front of us that are still challenging, and if we can execute, there's such a huge windfall for us if we can penetrate successfully into any of those three markets. Would be highly profitable if we can do so, because they're not key markets for us currently.
So do you look
as far as our finances?
So Brazil is basically like a midterm. Like, is the revenue there meaningful, or you're looking at it as like
the downloads are meaningful,
yeah,
and so it's a question of how do we foster our games to maximize what we can get from them. But there's obviously an audience there that they're definitely, so it's not necessarily untapped because they're there. But as far as how much money we can generate, it's limited. But we look at that as an opportunity as well. It's not our key one we're focusing on, but like I said, some small changes like just translating it into the local language is a part of that. And obviously, there's more you can do, but that would be a step that I would recommend different developers to look at.
I think in terms of South America, I think it's things are getting interesting these days because there's been a lot of hardware introduced that's high performing but low cost. For example, there are some new Nokia Android phones and that are very low cost, but they can actually run 3D games pretty well. So my feeling is, as you know, there's some really a lot of growth in some countries in South America in terms of economics. So my feeling is that it's getting close to the point where that territory will definitely be on our radar in terms of just having enough devices that can run high-end games.
What about like Middle East, like Arabic speaking countries? Do you guys see uptake there or anything interesting?
Yes, we have, and so we've localized as well. So, I mean, from a translation perspective, the initial upfront cost isn't tremendous. The bigger issue is when you've got a live game you're going to run for 2 years, is every update translating all the assets can become cost prohibitive. But we still have seen some good results in some of those territories as well.
Cool. All right, I think we'll start to get into questions. So I've got a couple questions through the tool online. So, question for a small team that may not be able to do extensive localization, which international markets would you recommend looking at?
Well, one strategy would be look at some of the top grossing games, look at languages that they've actually localized in, and try to figure out which ones that suit them best for their game style. But for us, definitely Russian.
Okay.
Brazilian Portuguese would be an overlooked one. Beyond obviously eFix and traditional Chinese, Japanese, Korean.
So essentially, those have the most bang for your buck, if you will, in terms of the market opportunity.
Not in a prioritized order there, but yeah. Turkish, perhaps.
Okay.
I guess it depends what the base language of the game is. If it's not English, then they should probably localize into English. But I think outside of that, then simplified Chinese, just because then you get China.
So basically, market-wise, Brazil, China, obviously European countries, other.
Yeah, I think like if you're really limited in terms of localization budget, if you only can afford to get couple languages in outside of English, you may want to look simply, for example, if we talk about European Western markets, you may want to just look at different genres that are trending in different countries. Yeah. So where you actually have more interest in a certain type of a genre of a game in French, might make more sense to localize it in French rather than German if there's not more pick up interest on that. So there's some research you should do to check out.
Yeah, so I think the feedback is basically it's going to depend slightly on the genre, but I think we hit some of the main markets to focus on. So I think we can do questions from the audience. So again, you can send them through online through the Slido, or do we have microphones?
Pick up what Miikka said while we wait for that. If that constrained, I would imagine German would probably be of the eFigs territories, probably your first bet.
Yeah.
From a value perspective.
Yeah, you're right.
Cool. So, other questions? Anyone?
So I've heard that there can be some markets where the users actually see games that are published in English as being higher quality, and when people have actually done the translation, they saw that their game was not as download, or the users that were using it were not as high quality as when they kept it in English and released it in other countries. Do you have any thoughts around that? And when it's good to localize language and when it's good to kind of keep that premium English brand?
Interesting question.
I mean, I guess it depends on the game and how important text is in the game. If it's not that important, then maybe it makes sense just to leave it in English. And the other thing is also, we talk about localization, but there's a massive difference between doing it well and doing it badly. We recently worked on a game. It was someone else's game, and we were just asked to check the localization, and they had translated the word. It was a fantasy game. They had translated the word dwarf into kobito in Japanese, which is a taboo word. You can't use that anymore. But I think even if you put it in Google Translate, it doesn't come out like that. So I'm not sure who did the original translation. So in that case, if that had gone out like that, absolutely the localized version would have been a lower quality version than the original English version. So it's super important to not just localize, but do it well, because the quality can go up or down depending on how you do it. The other thing I always say is focus on font. It sounds like a stupid thing, not that important, but you don't really want to be launching your game in Japan or China or whichever country with that country's equivalent of Comic Sans. So unless you know if it's right or not, then if you're not confident, if your localization plan is, here's our text file, send it to an agency, take that text file back and just put it into the game, then you have no idea if it's good or not. So I would just say, do it. Make sure you know what you're doing, and make sure you have someone do a quality check, because you can go very bad and wrong.
The font point is well taken. I think someone compared ours to Arial font, and for our Chinese equivalent, is saying that it's a very basic, boring font. Change it. To answer your question, from my perspective, we have not felt that that's the case. Our games are complex enough that we have to, for users to have a good experience, have it localized in their local language. But we have definitely seen companies that have worked with us and partnered with us that the Western game and the idea that it's Western content has an appeal, and so they've definitely used that for PR and marketing. This is a Western game. And that's why you should pay attention and look at it. So they've used that aspect rather than the English language directly to kind of to hit on the point that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think the quality thing is, I think, really important. I don't know all the specific markets, but there's some that are very particular about the translation. Like, I think in German users are, where they, it's like an offense if you have like very low quality translation.
So thank you very much.